I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
King Charles had spent a lifetime preparing himself for grief, scandal, rebellion, and the crushing responsibility of the crown. But nothing prepared him for the words Princess Anne was about to deliver. Behind a closed palace door, she revealed Queen Elizabeth's final confession, a secret deliberately withheld until the monarchy reached a moment of crisis. Charles listened without interrupting. Then his face drained of color, his hand slipped from the chair beside him, and the king collapsed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne had summoned her brother to a secluded room at Windsor and insisted that no aides or household officials be present. The request unsettled Charles. Private secretaries are senior advisors who help manage a sovereign's official duties. He knew this was no routine family conversation. Anne sat opposite him and said she was speaking from a private conversation she had documented, preserving it because Elizabeth had instructed her to wait. Charles leaned forward as Anne explained what the late queen had confessed. Elizabeth feared her son might one day sacrifice his own judgment simply to preserve peace inside the family. More painfully, she had entrusted Anne with one responsibility. If personal loyalty ever began endangering the crown, the monarchy's governing duty and institutional stability, her daughter was to confront him directly. The words devastated him. Charles tried to steady himself, but his mother's anticipation of this weakness cut deeper than criticism. He was not hearing rejection. That made it worse. Charles understood that Elizabeth had recognized the instinct he had spent years hiding behind: discipline. When people he loved were threatened, he delayed, softened, protected, and searched for compromise even when duty demanded distance. His breathing shortened. His hand reached toward the chair, missed, and the monarch crumpled beside it before Anne could finish. Anne moved immediately, kneeling beside her brother and calling his name until he responded. She was shaken, but she did not withdraw the confession. Breaking her promise to Elizabeth would have been easier, yet remaining silent would have betrayed the trust placed in her. When Charles finally sat upright again, pale and stunned, he asked whether that was everything. Anne's expression changed. It was not. She told him Elizabeth had also named the exact family crisis she feared would force him to choose between personal devotion and royal duty. Charles stared at her, then asked quietly, who was she talking about? Anne hesitated. In that silence, Charles understood his collapse was only the beginning, because his mother's final confession had been preserved to warn him about someone standing dangerously close to the throne. For the public, King Charles and Princess Anne represented two pillars of the same monarchy. In private, however, they had carried their mother's expectations very differently. Charles inherited the throne. Anne inherited something less visible, a private responsibility Elizabeth trusted her to use, only when everything else failed. Now brother and sister were sitting opposite each other with decades of loyalty between them, yet one final message from their mother had placed them on opposite sides of an unbearable truth. Charles remained pale after the collapse, as confusion hardened into hurt. He had spent decades waiting to become king, absorbing criticism and knowing every personal choice could eventually carry constitutional meaning. The public significance attached to actions taken by the sovereign, the reigning monarch. Anne had lived under the same mother, but carried a very different burden for years. Elizabeth trusted her daughter's discipline when emotion threatened duty. Charles looked at his sister and asked the question he feared. Had their mother truly doubted him? Anne did not soften the answer. She told him Elizabeth loved him deeply, but love was precisely what worried her. The queen believed his instinct to protect family could become dangerous once affection collided with responsibility. Charles flinched. The warning felt less like guidance and more like a judgment delivered after death, with no chance to defend himself. Anne felt the wound land, yet she continued. During their documented private conversation that night, Elizabeth had predicted this resistance. She warned her daughter that Charles might see the message as interference, even betrayal, before understanding its purpose. The monarch expected anger, not obedience. That unsettled him, because his reaction had been anticipated. Anne reached into the folder beside her and removed a handwritten summary she had sealed after that conversation. It carried no legal authority. It was simply her personal record of Elizabeth's instructions, kept so memory could not soften what had been said. She placed it between them. Charles stared at the page but did not touch it. Then Anne gave him the feared name, Camilla. Charles reached toward the record, then stopped. He asked whether the queen consort, his wife holding the title of queen without being the reigning sovereign, knew anything about Elizabeth's concerns. Anne held his gaze. No. The word landed harder than an accusation. Charles understood that his mother had carried this fear in silence, Anne had carried it in loyalty, and Camilla had lived beside him without knowing either truth. Yet the real danger was buried much deeper inside the family. Anne leaned forward and told her brother there had been one specific incident that changed Elizabeth's mind forever, and Charles had never been told what happened after he left the room. The confession did not begin on Elizabeth's final day, nor was it born from abstract fears about succession. According to Anne, there had been a specific moment, quiet, private, almost invisible to everyone outside the family, when the late queen became convinced that Charles might one day need someone strong enough to oppose him. It happened during an intensely private family conversation, when a seemingly simple disagreement exposed a fault line Elizabeth never forgot. Anne took her brother back to that night at Windsor, where tension had already been building around Camilla's future ceremonial influence. Ceremonial influence meant the informal weight a royal spouse could carry through public duties, access, and proximity to the sovereign. Elizabeth had watched Charles become protective of his private life after decades of scrutiny. Anne understood why. She had seen how quickly old wounds reopened whenever anyone questioned the woman he loved. Charles had entered that family meeting, determined to draw a line. Elizabeth listened, then told him that no spouse of a sovereign could ever become untouchable when the interests of the crown were involved. The crown, in this context, meant the monarchy as an institution rather than the person wearing it. Charles stiffened. He answered that he would not allow the institution to dictate every part of his marriage. Then, silence swallowed the room. Elizabeth did not follow him when he left. She remained seated with Anne, her anger replaced by something far more unsettling: fear. The Queen said the problem was not that Charles disagreed with her, it was that he had heard an institutional warning and received it as a personal attack. Anne defended her brother, saying he had endured judgment for years and deserved loyalty from his own family. Elizabeth removed her glasses, folded them slowly on the table, and asked her daughter one devastating question. What happens when loyalty itself stops someone from seeing the boundary they must enforce? Anne had no answer. The monarch then gave her daughter the responsibility that would shape everything to come. If Charles ever reached a moment when love and monarchy collided, Anne was to speak plainly to him, even if doing so damaged their relationship. "You may one day have to tell him what I cannot," Elizabeth said. Anne remembered the words because neither woman spoke for several moments afterward. Now Anne looked at Charles across the same family divide and told him that recent decisions inside the household had recreated the pattern their mother feared. Charles could dismiss an old warning as history, but he could not dismiss the present. Anne believed silence had become more dangerous than confrontation. And this time, Charles was ready to fight back. Shock gives way to anger. Charles has already heard that his mother feared his judgment could become compromised by personal loyalty. But learning that Anne actually promised Elizabeth she would intervene changes everything. The conversation is no longer about a dead queen's private concern. It is about a living sister who accepted responsibility for challenging the king. Charles rises, Anne refuses to retreat, and decades of sibling trust suddenly collide with the authority of the crown. Charles pushes his chair backward hard enough for it to scrape across the floor. He demands to know what right Anne had to preserve such a promise without telling him. Sovereignty, the king's ultimate constitutional authority as monarch, is not something a sibling can share. To him, the secrecy feels like an intrusion. Anne holds her ground and says Elizabeth gave her no constitutional power. She gave her a personal duty: speak when everyone around the sovereign might choose silence. Charles steps closer and accuses his sister of turning their mother's final years into a weapon against him. His voice rises. Anne's becomes quieter. She tells him the confession was never leverage, never a threat, and never something she wanted to carry. For years, she hoped the moment would never come. Then her composure cracks. Her voice trembles as she admits that keeping Elizabeth's trust has cost her more than Charles understands. Anne tells him why she finally acted. Several recent family decisions had been delayed, softened, or redirected because Charles feared what confrontation with Camilla might do to their marriage. The queen consort, The king's wife, who supports the monarch but does not reign herself, had not been condemned by Elizabeth. That distinction matters. The late queen feared any relationship becoming so emotionally powerful that a sovereign might hesitate when duty demanded a clear decision. Charles stares at Anne and asks the question beneath all the anger. Does she believe he failed their mother? Anne does not look away. I believe she was afraid you might fail yourself. The sentence stops him. Charles looks down, then back at his sister, wounded and furious at once. He demands proof, not memory, not interpretation, but everything Anne retained from that final documented conversation with Elizabeth. If she is going to challenge his judgment, he wants the full record placed before him. Anne reaches for the folder. Then she tells him the handwritten summary is not the only thing she kept. Charles says nothing. What Anne produces next will change the argument completely, because the question is no longer whether Elizabeth feared his weakness. It is whether someone close to the throne had already begun shaping the choices he believed were entirely his own. Royal power rarely announces itself with raised voices. More often, it appears in access, proximity, signatures, private conversations, and the quiet ability to influence what reaches the sovereign's desk. Elizabeth understood that better than almost anyone. Her confession to Anne was not simply about Charles's emotions. It was about the architecture surrounding a king, and the danger that begins when personal trust becomes indistinguishable from institutional influence. Anne lets the silence settle before making the point clear. No family member, including her, can command Charles. Sovereign authority means the monarch holds the final responsibility for decisions made in his name. The household around him can advise, warn, delay, or persuade, but the choice remains his. That is exactly why Elizabeth worried about influence that did not look like influence at all. Charles defends Camilla. He reminds his sister how much scrutiny his wife has survived, and how long their relationship was judged by people who never understood its cost. To question her now feels like reopening wounds the family had supposedly closed. Anne does not attack Camilla. Instead, she draws the line Elizabeth feared would disappear. Protecting someone from cruelty is not the same as protecting that person from scrutiny. Charles looks away. Anne reaches into the folder and removes a second handwritten page, created immediately after her last substantial documented conversation with their mother. It contains only brief phrases, not a formal document. One line stands apart from the rest. No one beside the sovereign must become beyond challenge. Charles reads it once, then again. The wording unsettles him because he remembers Elizabeth using the same principle years earlier when discussing the people closest to the throne. The anger begins to drain from Charles. For the first time, he cannot dismiss Anne's account as memory shaped by grief. The principle is familiar. It explains why Elizabeth focused on proximity rather than intention. A trusted person did not need to issue commands to affect a monarch. They could shape timing, tone, access, and hesitation by being the person he most feared disappointing. Charles finally picks up the page. He studies the line again, then sets it down carefully instead of pushing it away. Anne watches his expression move from resistance to reluctant recognition. He asks for time alone. Anne rises, but Charles stops her before she reaches the door. If he accepts their mother's warning, he says, then something inside his own household has to change immediately. The door closes behind Anne. Charles remains with the page in front of him, and grief hardens into decision. The first consequence will reach Camilla before she even knows Elizabeth's final confession has changed the balance around the king. The palace does not erupt. There is no dramatic announcement and no public decree. Instead, the first consequence arrives quietly. Anne summons Camilla for a private conversation and closes the door behind them. She expects a discussion about schedules and family tensions. What she receives is something far more personal. The king tells his wife that boundaries around royal decision-making are about to change, and the reason reaches back to words Elizabeth entrusted to Anne before her death. Charles has spent enough time with Anne's record to know he cannot bury the warning again. He tells Camilla that sovereign decision-making, the king's responsibility to make final choices on matters affecting the monarchy, must be separated from their private life. He is not removing her from royal duties, and he is not punishing her. But sensitive decisions will now go first through formal advisors before entering domestic conversations. Camilla freezes. She removes her glasses and places them beside her, then asks whether Charles believes she has interfered with his duty. He cannot give her the answer she wants. The problem, he says, is not intention. It is whether his desire to protect their marriage has sometimes made him delay choices he knew would hurt her. That distinction lands hard because it does not accuse her of control. It forces him to examine his own hesitation. Charles tells her why the change is happening. Elizabeth had warned Anne, in a documented private conversation, that personal loyalty could become dangerous if it made a sovereign avoid necessary conflict. Camilla immediately understands that his sister has carried this knowledge in silence. Surprise turns to hurt, then suspicion. She asks why Anne waited so long, and why she was allowed to decide when the warning should be used. Charles refuses the invitation to turn against his sister. Anne, he says, did exactly what their mother asked of her. For the first time, he openly validates the burden she carried, instead of treating it as an intrusion. Camilla hears the finality in his voice, and realizes this conversation is not about winning an argument. The balance inside the household has already shifted. Camilla looks at him and asks the question Charles has been avoiding since his collapse. Do you believe she was right about us? Charles remains silent. The pause becomes more painful than any accusation. Camilla understands that he is no longer defending their marriage automatically, while Charles realizes that protecting love and protecting judgment may no longer mean the same thing. Before the palace can absorb that change, he decides to find Anne again. This time, he will meet her not as king, but as a brother who finally needs the truth. After anger, collapse, accusation, and fear, Charles asks Anne to meet him again. But this time, there are no papers on the table, and no discussion about palace authority. He asks for something simpler, an honest conversation between a brother and sister. For once, the crown is not the subject. Their mother is. What follows changes the meaning of Elizabeth's confession from an accusation Charles cannot bear into a final act of protection he can finally understand. Charles chooses a small family sitting room and asks that no aides join them. An aide is a member of royal staff who assists with official duties, and leaving them outside strips the meeting of ceremony. Anne arrives expecting resistance. She thinks her brother may reject the confession, demand the handwritten records disappear, or accuse her again of carrying private authority she never possessed. Charles does something she does not expect. He admits why he collapsed. He tells Anne that Elizabeth's words reopened a fear he had carried for years. Becoming king had not erased the question buried beneath decades of preparation. Had he ever truly earned his mother's confidence? Charles had spent his life waiting for the crown, absorbing criticism while trying to prove he could carry it. Hearing that Elizabeth had prepared someone to challenge him felt, at first, like proof that she never fully trusted him. Anne refuses to let that interpretation survive. She tells Charles the warning existed because their mother believed he could correct himself when confronted with the truth. Elizabeth had not prepared for his failure. She had built a safeguard against it. Anne then shares one final detail from the documented conversation she preserved after speaking with the Queen. Elizabeth's last words about her son were not words of doubt. She believed Charles would choose duty. Anne explains that their mother expected him to resist, become angry, and feel wounded. But she also believed that once the emotion passed, he would understand what had to be done. Charles finally sees his sister's role differently. Anne was never appointed to oppose his reign. She was trusted to reach the man behind the title when rank and ceremony made honesty difficult. Charles reaches across the table and briefly places his hand over hers. Neither speaks. "You kept your promise," he says. Anne looks at him and answers, "I wish I had never needed to." Charles decides there will be no public family spectacle. He will show steadiness instead. Yet private pain leaves traces, and the change involving Charles, Anne, Camilla, and Elizabeth's final warning is already becoming visible beyond the palace walls. The outside world is about to notice. Royal families may conduct their most painful conversations behind closed doors, but the consequences rarely remain there. Within days, observers notice a change in Charles. His appearances seem more deliberate. Anne stands unusually close to the center of royal activity. Camilla remains composed, yet the atmosphere surrounding the household feels different. Then one striking public moment turns private speculation into a national conversation about Elizabeth's legacy, Charles's burden, and the extraordinary bond between the king and his sister. Charles continues his duties without canceling his broader program, determined to show that private pain will not destabilize the monarchy. His public program means the official schedule of engagements and responsibilities carried out by the sovereign. Anne appears beside him at an important engagement, and her presence immediately draws attention. The Princess Royal, the title traditionally held by the monarch's eldest daughter, seems calm, but the closeness between brother and sister carries new meaning after everything that happened behind palace doors. Charles feels the strain when Elizabeth's legacy is mentioned during the event. He pauses for just a moment, and Anne turns toward him. The glance is brief, but it steadies him. He continues speaking. Camilla, meanwhile, does not retreat from public duty. She remains composed and measured, making it clear that the new boundary inside the marriage has not become an open feud. Her restraint matters because one careless gesture could turn private correction into public humiliation. Then the story reaches the press. A major morning newspaper publishes a solemn image of Charles and Anne beneath the headline, "The Queen's Final Warning." Broadcasters seize on the phrase, framing the confession as Elizabeth's last attempt to protect the institution she served for decades. At Buckingham Palace, visitors gather near the gates as television crews discuss the story. One older woman holding flowers tells a reporter that the Queen appeared to have protected the crown even after she was gone. The sentence is repeated throughout the day. Charles refuses to answer with a dramatic statement. Instead, he decides his next family gathering will provide the clearest response. Anne will stand beside him. Camilla will remain beside him too. But the boundaries he has chosen will remain fully in the days ahead. As Charles and Anne leave their engagement, the crowd applauds. He turns toward his sister and says something quietly. She gives him a restrained smile. For the first time since the confession, he smiles back. The world has interpreted Elizabeth's words as a warning. Charles now understands them as something more difficult, a final act of trust. His last test is to honor that trust without sacrificing his wife, his sister, or the judgment the crown demands. In the end, Elizabeth's final confession does not destroy Charles. It does something far more difficult. It forces him to see himself clearly. The king who collapsed beneath the weight of his mother's words rises from that moment, understanding why she left them behind. Anne was never sent to undermine him. Camilla was never condemned as an enemy. Elizabeth's true warning concerned the most dangerous weakness any sovereign can face, allowing love, fear, or loyalty to become stronger than judgment. Charles finally accepts that his mother's concern was never a prediction of failure. It was a safeguard, a final protection built around the throne by someone who understood how lonely power could become. The crown, the institution and responsibilities carried by the sovereign, could not depend on agreement alone. Elizabeth wanted one person close enough to love her son and strong enough to challenge him when emotion clouded duty. Anne feels the burden lift at last. She no longer carries the confession alone, and Charles no longer sees her promise as betrayal. At a private family gathering, he walks toward his sister and thanks her quietly. She does not celebrate. She simply tells him she did what their mother asked. The tension between them is gone, replaced by something stronger than obedience, trust tested by pain. Charles then turns to Camilla with the honesty he had avoided before. He tells his wife their marriage is not the weakness Elizabeth feared. The danger would come only if either of them demanded protection at the expense of duty. Camilla accepts the boundary, even though the late queen's concern still hurts. She understands that love can remain intact without being placed above accountability. Charles now understands his collapse differently. He did not fall because Elizabeth rejected him. He fell because her words struck the fear he had buried for decades, that personal wounds might one day guide sovereign judgment. Once he names that fear, it loses its power over him. At the gathering, Charles sees Anne across the room and tells her their mother knew exactly whom to trust with the message. She answers, "She trusted both of us." He looks toward Camilla, then back at his sister, and finally understands. Elizabeth left no punishment behind. She left a mirror. Anne held it up. Charles chose to look. The monarchy survives not because emotion disappears, but because duty stands above it. Charles remains king, Camilla remains beside him, and Anne remains the sister willing to say what nobody else could. And the promise is fulfilled. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.